Greetings, and thank you for tuning in to an online edition of History 1301. We've been talking about two important things in the recent past. One has been the establishment of the Jamestown colony. We know that in Jamestown, the English were establishing that colony for the same reasons that the Spanish were establishing colonies in New Spain, the French were establishing their colonies in New France. It was to build an empire and make England rich. But the way in which Jamestown was established and the way in which it governed itself was very, very different than any other European model that we have talked about to date. Whereas New Spain was very authoritarian, in other words, the government had a heavy role to play with respect to who did what and how they did it. Jamestown was pretty much given its own reins when it comes to governing itself. It had its own governing system, it had its own court system, and so therefore what we see develop is the beginning of an American political consciousness. I want you to keep that in the back of your mind when we talk about this next group of English colonists that will establish colonies about 500 miles north of Jamestown in New England. Now, there's a couple groups that we need to talk about. The first group that I'd like you to be mindful of is a group that, well, they call themselves a lot of different things, but you probably know them as the Pilgrims. Now, the Pilgrims were basically a sect of religious exiles. They had gotten into some hot water with King James in England, and they felt that they were being persecuted. So in 1620, they set sail aboard a ship that I bet you're familiar with, the Mayflower, and later that year they arrived in the present-day city and at that point in time the colony of Plymouth. Now this is well before Massachusetts was a colony, let alone a state, but the Plymouth colony is important for a lot of different reasons. First of all, this is the second permanent English colony that manages to stick in North America. Jamestown was the first. But there's a few other things that I'd like you to be mindful of when it comes to the Pilgrims. Okay. Like I said before, the Pilgrims saw themselves as religious exiles. So when they were coming across the Atlantic Ocean, they saw this as a place where they could practice their religion, or at least their brand of religion, openly, freely, and without the threat of persecution. That's very different than what we were talking about in Jamestown. I mean, just about all of those people were coming for economic freedom, and more importantly, economic fortune. Religion was a factor, but not nearly to the extent that it was with respect to the Pilgrims. So one of the things that I want you to note very directly was that this was an initiative, as far as the Pilgrims were concerned, to not only escape the persecution that they were facing in England, but also maybe to purify, to correct what they saw as the wrongs of the Anglican brand of religion back in England. Now, while they were aboard the Mayflower, a group of leaders, including a guy that would later go on to become the second governor of the Plymouth colony, a guy by the name of William Bradford, signed a very important contract that came to be known as the Mayflower Compact. Now, let me be really clear what I'm talking about here. This was essentially the governing document that would set up the rules and the foundation for the legal system, how things would work once they got to the New World. But it was the governing document of the Plymouth colony. And this is being signed, it's being disputed well before they even had arrived in the New World. So for your notes, one of the things that I really would like you to be mindful of is a lot of historians point to the Mayflower Compact as the first American Constitution. Now obviously they don't mean that this was, like the American Constitution in the sense that it's setting up a Bill of Rights or something like that, but the idea that it's a governing contract, or more importantly, a social contract between the individual and the rest of the society of how things would be once the society got up and running and off its feet. So the Mayflower Compact is very important for a number of different reasons, but just like Jamestown, economic freedom and self-representative government, it's important with respect to the idea of an American political consciousness, that there should be this central document that spells out what the rules are, what the obligations are, and more importantly, what the penalties would be if you violate those policies. So, the Puritans, or excuse me, the Pilgrims are doing their thing in the 1620s, and just like in Jamestown, they struggle to get that colony off the ground. But once they have it sustainable, what you begin to see is a relatively good working relationship with the local Native American tribe. And what you generally see is this cooperation between Bradford in particular, who was very, very proactive with respect to befriending the Native Americans and utilizing their hospitality, shall we say. And this ultimately crystallizes in a celebration, so to speak, and how we remember that in popular American culture is we credit William Bradford for establishing what we call Thanksgiving. So the Wampanoag people, the native group that had befriended the Pilgrims when they arrived in what is now Plymouth, were instrumental in their survival, considering the Pilgrims really didn't know how to do things like farm. I mean, many of them had been peasant farmers back in Britain, but you have to understand that the topography and the climate was much different in the New World than it was in Europe, anywhere in Europe for that matter. So in Europe, when you want to plant wheat, all you do is you just sprinkle seed, and you scratch out some soil and you sprinkle seed here, there, and everywhere. What the Wampanoag people taught the English, the Pilgrims, when they got here, was that corn needed to be planted and you needed to mound it up. In other words, you'd plant a corn kernel, a seed in there, and then you would build the mound around it. And to fertilize it, what you could do is drop a fish in there, and that would help it to grow, and it would ultimately improve your chances of establishing sustainable food sources. So what I'd like you to understand is the Wampanoag people were instrumental with respect to Plymouth's survival. Another group that we need to talk about with respect to the establishment of the New England colonies, the Puritans. Now, Pilgrims, Puritans, many of you may say potato, potato, and they are similar in a lot of ways. Like the Pilgrims, the Puritans were exiles, and as their name suggests, they felt that the Anglican faith, the Church of England that is, had become corrupted. It had lost its way, so to speak. It had abandoned its true mission, and therefore it needed to be purified. So, several years after the the Plymouth colony is established, we see another group of English religious exiles coming over to New England, hoping to establish freedom of religion, and that's the Puritans. Now, the Puritans are a little bit different than the Pilgrims at the same time. Whereas the Pilgrims saw their mission as to practice their faith openly and freely and to purify the process, the Puritans had no room for interpretation when it comes to any other types of religion. The Pilgrims were a little more tolerant when it comes to that. But the guy that I really want you to be mindful of, and you had to read a little bit on him, is a guy by the name of John Winthrop. And John Winthrop would later go on to become the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, or the present-day city of Boston. And Bradford establishes Boston with like this vision. It's almost seen like this city on the hill, the beacon of Protestant Christianity. So one of the things that Bradford makes very clear early on is that anybody that's not Puritan will not be any type of citizen, so to speak. You can't vote. In certain instances, you don't have access to the courts. In certain other instances, you can't own or purchase property. But nonetheless, the Massachusetts Bay Colony is established under Winthrop, and one of the people that he recruits to help him get this off the ground is another Puritan leader back in England, a guy by the name of Roger Williams. Now, when Bradford, or excuse me, not Bradford, but Winthrop recruits Williams, he feels that this is sort of his protege, so to speak. This is a guy that's really going to help him establish the Puritan faith in the New World. So Williams comes over and he starts to survey the situation. And one of the things that he finds very troubling is the fact that the state and religion are deeply, deeply, deeply intertwined. As I'd mentioned before, you couldn't vote if you were a Puritan. So that meant that the Puritan Church had a very big influence on elections. You didn't have access to courts and other branches of the government unless you were a Puritan. And so therefore, the Puritan Church was an extension of the government. Williams felt that that was a problem. Now, not for the reasons that you may think. We are talking about the separation of church and state, but Williams believed that when you combine church and state, that politics would inevitably have a corrupting aspect, a corrupting impact on religion. And so what you would ultimately have is the same problem that the Anglican Church had back in England, Henry VIII, the leader of both the state of England and also the Anglican Church. So one of the things that he told Winthrop is you need to get religion out of politics and you need to keep it out of politics. Well, Winthrop was so taken aback by this that he basically banished Roger Williams, and he said, you don't got to go home, but you can't stay here. So what Williams does is he goes about 50 miles to the south and he establishes the present-day colony of Rhode Island. Now, just like Massachusetts Bay Colony, Rhode Island is, for all intents and purposes, a Puritan enclave, with one key exception. And that exception is that you can practice whatever religion you like. It was a lot like Maryland in the sense that if you were Catholic, you could practice that openly. If you were Lutheran, you could practice that openly. Jewish, you could practice that openly. Now, don't get me wrong, they certainly sold the Puritan religion, so to speak, when it comes to converting people, but they didn't force it upon people the same way that Winthrop was doing in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Okay? So the big point that I want you to take away from Roger Williams and Rhode Island is this notion that church and state needed to be separate from one another. Now, it's probably for different reasons than you and I think of this notion today, but still, you're seeing the crystallization of the American political thought, right? American political consciousness. The idea that church and state needed to be separate from one another. Now, one of the things that we see emerge in the New England colonies, throughout the colonies, but primarily New England, is the idea of witchcraft. The Puritans were obsessed with religion and felt that God was everywhere and God could work through people and could do his work through people, but if God can do this, then so can Satan. And so the idea of witchcraft was that the devil was working through individuals to do his bidding. Okay? Now, one of the things that we see, begin to develop in the 1640s and forward is the idea of what we would call a witch hunt. That there are these people out there that are practicing witchcraft and we need to sniff them out and we need to bring them to justice. And so what you see over the course of time, especially in places like Salem, Massachusetts, you see the beginning of what people call the Salem witch trials. Okay? Now, I guess that begs the question, what would get you accused of being a witch? Well, in short, virtually anything. There's a really good book and a not-so-bad film called The Crucible, and I bet many of you are familiar with it, maybe not have read it, but you've certainly heard of it. And something as simple as holding a frog could implicate you when it comes to being a witch. Now, the problem isn't necessarily that you're being accused of being a witch. The problem is accusation in and of itself is seen as sufficient proof, sufficient evidence. Now, we know that in our legal system, the onus is on the state to prove the charges that they're charging you are true, that you don't have to implicate yourself, you don't have to bear witness against yourself. That was certainly not the case with the Salem witch trials. The onus was almost certainly on the individual accused of being a witch to prove their innocence. Now, there's a really good clip, a segment rather, on the video series Shaping America that talks about a witchcraft trial, in particular the witchcraft trial of Rebecca Nurse. I'm going to leave a lot of that up to you to view on your own, but one of the things that I think that you'll find is that testimony was falsified, and later on people admitted to giving false testimony, even under oath. And over the course of time, in Salem alone, 14 people were hanged or put to death in another relatively violent manner for being a witch. Now, later on, what you see happen, especially toward the fall of those years, is you begin to see cooler heads prevail and more scientific understandings of the world around you. For instance, one of the Puritan ministers in Salem, or around Salem at the time, was a guy by the name of Cotton Mather, who used to say that if lightning hit your house, that was clearly God's message that said that you better clean up your act. You were not living the holy life, and therefore that needed to change. So as this more secular, scientific-based understanding begins to grip New England, the witch hunts seceded, or receded rather, in the horizon. One of the things that really sticks is the idea of a Yemen society. It's not as if when the witch trials went away, Puritans and other religious officials within the New England colonies just simply washed their hands of living the holy life. There was always this really impulsive need to keep busy. And you've heard the expression, idle hands are the devil's workshop. You see a very intense work ethic that begins to develop in Puritan New England. And one of the ways that people felt that they could keep hands busy was by establishing a farming economy. Okay? And what that meant was you were going to have to give everybody a little slice of land. I mean, maybe not a plot as big as somewhere in Jamestown, but if you would give them land, yeah, it would accomplish two things. One of the things that it would accomplish is a self-sustaining society. If people are farmers, they can grow their own food and they can feed their own families, and you don't necessarily have to rely on other people the same way that we had that happen in Jamestown. But the other thing that you can do is you can keep people busy. And farmers are pretty labor-intensive workers. So this was seen as a double-edged sword when it comes to the benefit. Now, I'm not saying that this was Disney World or this was substantially better than anywhere else. It was a hard, difficult life. But at the same time, if you were to ask me, do you want to go to Jamestown as a worker, or would you rather go as a working-class individual to New England? I'm going to go to New England, because what they're establishing there is a Yemen society. And that Yemen society emphasizes land ownership. The word Yemen just means a small farmer that's producing for either very local consumption or to feed his family. And so this Yemen outlook on the world essentially offered more and more opportunities for people to own land, whereas that was generally not the case in Jamestown. I mean, generally the people that owned the land were your wealthier individuals. So there's a few things that I want to wrap up with, and one of those things is the idea of an American political thought, right? The development of American political thought. And we've seen this in a variety of ways. We've seen it with the Mayflower Compact, the idea that that there should be this one governing document that spells out the rules and the penalties for violating those rules. We've seen the separation of church and state with the establishment of the Rhode Island colony. And we've talked about the idea of a Yemen society in New England, generally speaking. The idea that ownership of land and opportunities, generally speaking, ought to be afforded individuals if you really are going to achieve whatever goal it is that you're trying to achieve, whether that be the purification of the Protestant faith or the democratic system later on in the early 1800s, and we'll understand that when we talk about Thomas Jefferson. But for the time being, I want you to put Puritan New England in the forefront of your mind when it comes to the development of American political thought.